with you via email after the webinar. If you would like to view captions now, you can please select the live transcript button on your toolbar. It's at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then you can press show subtitles. As you can see, we have our amazing ASL interpreter signing. We really appreciate you being here today. If you have a question, you can select the Q&A button on your toolbar. You can enter your question and click send. We have a packed conversation and maybe won't be able to answer every single question, but we're going to do our best. We have lots of NOD staff here to help support and field questions. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a simple survey. These really, really help us to make sure that we are providing the best content possible. So if you have a minute and it's super short, we hope you can just give us some responses so that we can shape our programming going forward. Okay, now housekeeping stuff out of the way. Time to get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation. Today is really special because, as I believe Bridget mentioned in the chat, it is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is an opportunity to focus global attention on digital access and inclusion for more than 1 billion people worldwide living with disabilities. In my own work here at NOD, particularly in the last year or so, helping build and scale learning systems that support disability inclusion across the workforce, I have seen firsthand how quickly organizations are trying to adapt to this moment, right? Like, if you think about a year ago, the adoption of tools like ChatGPT compared to where it is now, the growth is explosive and companies are really just trying to keep up, and we're here to support that growth. There's a desire to get it right, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what right means, and there's a lot of stakeholders, and we want to make sure that people with disabilities are included in that discussion. In many ways, AI presents an amazing opportunity to expand accessibility. Tools like we're using right now, like real-time captioning, image recognition, voice interface, personalized user experiences that adapt to individual needs. When designed well, those tools can remove barriers and open doors that have historically been closed. I mean, I personally know myself and other colleagues with disabilities at NOD use AI tools every day. So, just want to reiterate, this is not about AI tools are not bad. They can be amazing, but there's also gaps, right? We see these persistent gaps, and AI systems are only as good as the data and the assumptions behind them, right? So when disability and thoughtfulness around people with disabilities is not included in the data sets, in the inputs, when lived experience is missing from the design process or not considered from the start, then these technologies can reinforce exclusion. And it's a really helpful reminder that bias in AI, it's not abstract. It's actually built into the design process because AI tools learn from human information, right? We feed them information based on human experience, and that's how AI tools feed us outputs, right? So, like any technological process, bias can be built in as a bug, not necessarily a feature of that process. And like any bug, we can identify it, we can address it, and then we can prevent it going forward. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. And one thing I've learned through our work with employers is that technology alone doesn't create these problems and it doesn't solve these problems, right? Humans are part of this process. So it takes intentional design, education, a shared understanding, a foundation of values, and the capability across organizations to recognize where those barriers exist and how we can address them. So we're really not talking about whether or not AI will shape accessibility. It is, and it will. The real question is how intentional are we going to be about shaping it? And that's going to require moving beyond just retrofitting after the fact and instead really embedding the value of accessibility from the beginning. It means involving people with disabilities, not just as user testers, but as designers, as decision makers, as leaders. And it means aligning innovation with a value of responsibility across technology, across policy, across organizational culture. And these are heavy questions, right? These are heavy topics. And this is a really nascent area of discussion. And so it's really important for all of us who we're all leaders in some way in our organization to dig into these questions. We have some amazing expert panelists that are going to help us think through these. And then, I'd really encourage you all to think about what can you take back from this to your daily work, to your team meetings, to the implementation of new technology in your organizations. So ultimately, accessibility, right? It's about people. That's why we are all here. That's why we have these panelists, and it's about their real experiences. So to bring this conversation to that experiential level, I'd love to introduce our first panelist, Winston Clements. Winston is a keynote speaker, accessibility consultant, and disability inclusion strategist, helping organizations build cultures where disabled people can truly thrive. Before this, he spent nearly a decade working in the tech industry, shaping how we think and work today, especially regarding AI, accessibility, and designing systems that work for everyone and not just the majority. Winston, it's so lovely to have you. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here and happy GAD, everyone. For my visual description, I am a black male. I have a condition known as osteogenesis imperfecta, which means I have a small stature. I'm about 3 feet tall. And my haircut today, I used to have long shoulder length hair back in the day, but today I've got a very short haircut and I'm sitting in my power wheelchair, which might be visible on your screen. And today I'm dressed in a short sleeve, collared, burnt orange shirt with vertical stripes.
Thank you, Winston. We're so happy to have you. I think some of the questions that we really want to navigate today include how inaccessible systems show up for disabled people in navigating digital tools in workplaces, why it's important for inclusive design to center disabled voices from the beginning of the process. How can organizations move from a compliance-based approach to accessibility toward meaningful lived experience-driven inclusion? So, um, just kind of as we dig into that, I'm curious, Winston, what has your experience been in terms of how inaccessible systems have impacted your ability to navigate digital tools, work remote, be successful in your workplace?
Yeah, this is a really good question because for me, inaccessibility in systems, especially digital systems, it's not usually dramatic, at least in my experience. It tends to be something that builds up and is cumulative. So I tend to think of it like 1,000 small cuts that build up over
Mm,
time. And in my experience, again, and I think many people relate to this, the gap often starts quite early. So with inaccessible systems, and I can relate this back to my previous work as a software developer, it starts with disabled people and voices missing from that early phase of design, development, testing, even the decision making as these systems are being put together. And one example I like to give is because I do some travel for my work and I tend to go through the airport a number of times every year. And one really cool system, which I think we all appreciate, is the fingerprint scanner machines that allow you to get through border control quicker.
mm.
And for me, this is an example of an incredible tool, but maybe where people with disabilities were not included in the design because every time I get to that kiosk, I realize that this is a great machine, but I cannot reach it
Yeah.
from my seated wheelchair position. And so for me, that's a clear-cut example of how when things get missed from a disability perspective from early on, it then has this build up over time to the point where I'm now having to find a member of staff to help me
Right.
get through border control. Um, and I know we're speaking about AI, and I feel like AI can create some of those barriers too. So as that cumulative effect builds up, as we get downstream, that's when you realize you have an AI voice interface that might not recognize speech differences, or an imaging tool that doesn't have alt text, for example. Or, one that we've all heard about is the hiring software that will screen out resumes where there are gaps in employment, which tends to be a typical thing for people with disabilities. So it's just kind of shifting left and bringing those voices in early is what I have noticed.
Yeah, I guess on that note, that's a great transition. Like, can you share about an example of when you've seen disabled voices sort of centered in the design process from the beginning and how kind of the outcomes have been different?
Yeah, and this is a great question because even thinking back to my work as a technologist, that wasn't a common thing to see, right? And so the times when I saw disabled people considered and involved, it was more in a consulting type of basis. Like, oh, we have this guy, Winston, who has a disability. Let's just do a quick check with him
Mm.
before we build this thing. And I think that's okay, but I think there's another level where, you know, you could go further and actually involve disabled people in a more committed way through actually hiring them to be full-time consultants on a project, and also not hiring just one person with a disability. In my case, like I've shared, I've got a physical disability, but we also know that 80% of disabilities are non-apparent. And
Hmm.
so having that diversity of disabled voices also goes a long, long way just to make sure that you're building something that helps more people, that helps everyone.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and also why I think so much of our work at NOD sort of centers on the human resource side of things.
Yeah.
Because if you have a strong representation of people with disabilities across multiple types of disabilities on your staff, right, you're gonna have an easier path towards including employees in the design process. I think that's such a good point. And I think what I hear you saying is like, okay, it's something. It's better than nothing to say,
Yeah.
"Hey, Winston, can you check this out before putting it out?" Like that's better than nothing. But that's also not enough because it's surface level.
Yeah, 100%. And we just want to create change that is meaningful, accessibility that is meaningful. And one thing I really try to encourage the organizations that I partner with is to get away from tokenistic behaviors when it comes to accessibility, or get away even from a compliance approach where we just want to make sure we ask the one guy who uses a wheelchair about this tool, and actually think of ways to make it more meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's right. Like, I think so much of what has been done on the accessibility front has been compliance oriented, and how we move from that approach to an approach that is really driven by lived experience. And, I think all the folks on this call, we know this, but maybe others don't, that generally any of these changes that are better for accessibility are actually better for everyone. They end up being better for both people with disabilities and people without disabilities, right? So this is just like good design, not just, okay, a focus on accessibility because it's the right thing to do. That's something
Yeah.
that we try to preach a lot. It's not just about doing the right thing, it actually is better for your company in the long run.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess last question, real quick, and then we'll transition over to Ariana. Do you, in your work with companies, is there anything specific or practical that you could share that has been really effective in this sort of disability-centered design, that just like any practical things that folks on the call could bring back to their organizations?
Yeah, definitely. I think one is the idea that we just touched on a little bit, Sarah. So moving away from compliance to actually stuff that is more meaningful. And, you know, I kind of see compliance as a two-way thing. So for me, it can mean, I guess the bad way is, just that box ticking approach where we want to do the bare minimum by ADA or WCAG perspective, for example.
Hmm.
But I think there's also the other side of it, which is more positive, which is where we want to, I guess, focus on metrics and measuring our progress. And I think that's a helpful type of
Mm,
compliance. And because that takes you to a place where you're asking meaningful questions, for example. So instead of, did we meet the minimum requirement, to something like, would a disabled person actually enjoy working here or
right.
find it easy to use our tools, for example?
Right.
So that's one thing I would really encourage. The other thing I would say is I'm encouraging organization and teams to really experiment, especially with the AI tools that are available. And if I can have 10 seconds, I can quickly show something that I created just this morning before this call. Um, and this is just typically this would have been something that would require, as you can see, a bunch of code, a bunch of Python code
Okay.
to create. And I was able to knock this up using Claude in about 10 minutes. And this is
Wow.
an alt text generator. So you
Oh,
simply
cool.
drag an image into here. I just pop something in here and it will create some text for you for that image, which for me is helpful in my work, make sure that all my content is
That's very cool.
accessible and also for social media posts as well. This is something that is super useful and something that, yes, I do have an engineering background, but all I did was use plain English prompts in
Right.
Claude, and I was able to knock something that looks pretty cool actually. So take that experimentation approach into your work and see if you can optimize and make your own workflows more accessible.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, super cool and super easy, right? And a great example of like why of how AI can be a super powerful tool for accessibility. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Winston. We are going to transition over to Ariana, but we'll come back to you in just a little bit. And don't forget, we will have some time at the end for Q&A for the panelists. So already see some questions in the chat. My team is monitoring those. And hopefully we'll be able to circle back to them. So with that, I'd like to bring in our second panelist, Ariana Abulafia. Ariana is an attorney with a strong background in public interest advocacy with expertise in disability technology, criminal law, and the First Amendment. She leads the Disability Rights in Technology Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which focuses on the ways in which certain technologies, including automated employment decision systems used in hiring, impact people with disabilities. Ariana, we're so happy to have you. We're delighted. I'll let you introduce yourself real quick and then we'll get into the questions.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be on this panel with Winston and to talk a little bit about these really important topics today. As a visual description, I am in my 30s, 30 something. Um, I am a Sephardic woman, light brown, olive skin, curly brown hair that has gone way past my shoulders at this point, even though I try to keep it in check. And I'm wearing a white button-down shirt and I have a blurred background. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. So I know really your expertise sits at sort of this intersection of technology and disability inclusion. So we want to get into some more specific questions around how bias shows up in our technological systems. Um, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the just absolute widespread use of algorithms to power everything we do and algorithmic bias can show up in ways that directly affect disability rights in our technological systems.
Sure, yeah. So I think to answer that, the first thing I would want to do is kind of like push back a little bit on this thing you had said earlier, Sarah, about bias being a bug, not a feature. Um, I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. I don't know that features and bugs is the best way to think about it. And
Yeah.
if in fact we were to think about it that way, I would actually probably argue that bias is a feature, not a bug, the other way around.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that the reason I would say that is because there are all sorts of reasons why algorithmic tools and AI systems wind up being biased, right? And one is this thing you hit on earlier about under-inclusive data sets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the data sets that are being used to, create and to train these systems are not properly inclusive of disability data. And there's all sorts of reasons why that is. There's stigma that may sort of prevent some folks with disabilities from identifying that way. There's potentially a lack of like the real sorts of community engagement that we would need to, ensure that that type of data does exist, all sorts of things, right? So part of it are the data issues that are sort of inherent to building data sets that would create less biased outputs. However, and this I think you also sort of mentioned is that it's inherent to the creation of any tool that we as humans have biases and that those biases wind up being sort of reflected in the tools that we make. And
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, one of the things I've done also throughout my career, in addition to disability policy, has actually been journalism. And you see the same question in journalism, right? Like, is it better for journalists to say, no, I'm unbiased, I tell my tale with no slant, right?
Right.
Or is it better to say, no, in fact, I do have a bias, here's what it is, here's my angle, and
Mm-hmm.
then you just know, right? And so to a certain extent, the tools are biased because we are biased, and the people who build the tools are biased. And that said, right, the idea that we could conceptualize bias as a feature, not a bug, the conclusion is still the same, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
conclusion is that we can still do something about it. Um, and so the question as to like the concrete examples as to how this is impacting. Um, so we see this a lot in employment, right? Through hiring tools that may, on one hand, in one bucket, be inaccessible to people with disabilities. And that's things like gamified assessments and personality tests. We can talk about that more later. Um, and also that may sort of screen out otherwise qualified people with disabilities from jobs. And that's sometimes you think about that in the form of like resume screeners and that sort of thing. Um, we see this in education. I recently wrote something on the use of generative AI in building out and developing IEPs for disabled students, and how that could potentially impact the ability of disabled students to, engage fully in their educational environment. We've seen algorithmic systems being used in benefits determinations, particularly with HCBS, home and community-based services, and that these algorithmic systems were unfairly cutting people from those benefits and those programs. We see it in healthcare, where we have health providers using things like triage algorithms and opioid use algorithms, and those can impact people with disabilities in very real and potentially problematic ways. We see it in housing, with tenant screening algorithms that can, let's say, take into account medical debt as a negative factor, with people with disabilities being disproportionately likely to have that as an experience, right? Um, the thing that I would emphasize is the short answer to your question is that we are far past the point where, let's say, you are a person with a disability or a multiply marginalized person with a disability, and you don't want to use AI, right? Like that is the stance that you have, and you don't want to use, let's say, large language models, and you don't want to use ChatGPT or something like that, right? Um, Assuming arguendo that's your position, you are still going to interact with these
Yeah.
systems
Yeah.
because AI has been and algorithms have been incorporated into every system that we are interacting with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So we can't avoid it. So the next best thing is to understand it, understand the role it plays in those systems, which requires an understanding of the ways the systems are impacting us as people with disabilities, and then to be able to understand the role of the tool, how it may be serving as a force multiplier for good or not, and how to structure things so that we can maximize benefits and minimize harms.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, right? There's no, it's here. It's in our daily lives. Like we just have to figure out how we can work best within the system. Um, so with that said, I guess if a company or, anybody on this call who's leading a department or a team or an organization, if they want to be proactive rather than reactive, knowing that this is here and this is a system we are working within, what should they be paying attention to right now in this sort of evolving policy landscape?
Yeah, so this is I'm going to echo something that Winston said on like thinking beyond compliance, right? And I'll
Hmm.
give examples as to why, and this is as an attorney, I'm kind of thinking about this too, right? Like why should you think beyond compliance? And one of the reasons for that is because compliance can change, right? And a really good example of that is what we're seeing right now with the Title II rules of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a broad sort of anti-discrimination statute in the United States that sort of prevents discrimination against people with disabilities in all sorts of arenas. Title II of that law provides for anti-discrimination in public for public entities. Um, and last year, the Department of Justice issued a rule that basically created technical standards for how websites and apps should be uh, compliant in order to be accessible to people with disabilities. And that's for quote unquote public entities. So you can think about an elections website or the website of a local educational school board or like things like that. Um, and this year, that there was all sorts of sort of back and forth, and the deadline got pushed back an additional year. But there might be future rulemaking that changes what the standard is, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG, as Winston mentioned, standards. It could exempt smaller entities. It could create more rules, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen when it comes to compliance. Um, and so I don't think that compliance is the standard. And also in general, right? One of the things about thinking about compliance from a legal perspective, laws sometimes move very slowly. Technology moves quite quickly, right? And so what we have is this almost inherent space in between what the law regulates and what the technology builds, and to a certain extent, like unleashes upon us, right? And so thinking about like being responsible with technology from the perspective of compliance, it's never going to do it right. And the thing is that it's too important to not do it right. And so I think a lot about, what does it look like to like build it right? What does it look like to do it right? As opposed to what is the bare minimum? And to a certain extent, even accessibility. And it's not to say that we are not fighting many, many battles on accessibility, but oftentimes for populations outside of folks with disabilities, you don't hear oh, I built this thing and people can use it and I'm supposed to like laud you for it, right?
Right.
Like to a certain extent, compliance is the floor and so is accessibility, right? And we need to think more
Yeah.
broadly about how these tools are impacting disabled people and multiply marginalized disabled people.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. And also I love how you kind of combine what you and Winston were talking about because we're going to bring Winston back and then we're going to kind of have a group discussion. Welcome back, Winston. Um, Anything, and before I sort of jump in with my questions, Winston, anything that came up for you or anything you want to share just in response to what Ariana was saying?
No, I love everything that was said, and I think the thing that stuck out for me the most was not just compliance being the flaw, but also accessibility being the flaw.
Hmm.
Because I think sometimes as a disabled person, you do absorb a lot of internalized ableism, and accessibility can
Hmm.
feel like the gold standard or the holy grail of what a life experience is supposed to be. But actually, when you think about it, even in the built environment, accessibility is an elevator or a ramp to get into the building, to get into the facility.
Right,
You haven't even
right,
experienced what's inside yet. So
right,
I really
right.
love that reframe. That was helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That is helpful. Um, Okay, so let's talk a little bit more on the practical side. I've kind of been pushing on this a little bit because I know that like I mean I read a comment in the chat that I think really probably resonated with a lot of people that was like, or maybe it was in the Q&A that like there are so many variations of disabilities. Does it seem overwhelming to anyone else about how to account for all needs in a meaningful way? And I think that question comes from a genuine place, right? That can feel a bit overwhelming. Like we want to make sure that our systems are inclusive of everyone. And we are working within budget constraints and time constraints and staff capacity constraints. So I'd love to hear you guys speak to how, like, what are the practical first steps that you could take right now to design, deploy, audit, whatever, really start moving the needle on more inclusive AI systems?
This is Ariana. I'll start here. And the first thing I'll say is that the work that I do is cross disability in nature. And so CDT's Disability Rights Project, and what I mean by that is that CDT's Disability Rights Project focuses on, policy solutions sort of across disabilities, which makes it a little bit different than some of the sort of big time legacy disability rights organizations in the United States, like the National Federation for the Blind and the National Association for the Deaf, that respectively, focus on blind and low vision folks, deaf and hard of hearing folks, et cetera. And so doing disability policy in general can be difficult. Doing disability policy in relation to emerging technologies can be difficult. Doing it in a cross-disability way and trying to find solutions that fit for everyone is, I think the best thing to do just from a starting point and like a level setting is to understand that no marginalized group is a monolith, but folks with disabilities in particular, this can be really difficult. And especially if we are, approaching things and trying to make things better for everyone. I think this is like the crux of inclusive design, though, right? And like how inclusive design has always gone about, or been applied in the context of physical spaces and then later digital spaces, right? The idea that you can build things that are better for everyone. And if you build things that are better for everyone, you're going to hopefully include that cross disability space in there, right? And so on like really sort of like concrete things that someone could do, the first thing I always recommend is transparency, right? So what that means is that if you are, let's say, an employer and you want to use an AI tool, the first thing you should think about is not how to deploy that AI tool. It's how am I going to tell potential new hires, current employees, my board, right? Like everyone should know that you're using this tool. Um, and in the context of hiring tools, as an example, right? I was giving a talk once where I argued that transparency should be required. I believe transparency should be required, legally speaking. In the US, it is not in this particular context. Um, and someone pushed back at me and said, well, you just want people to know when AI tools are being used in hiring because you're litigious and you want people to sue each other. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and this has now become my favorite joke, which is I am quite litigious. No, no, but the reason why, among others, is because number one, I believe that people have the right to know these things as a philosophical matter, right? But secondarily, the purpose is not so a disabled person becomes harmed, doesn't get a job that they otherwise would have been qualified for, and then has to file a lawsuit. That's a pain for everyone. The purpose is because if you have transparency from the back end, someone may be able to request an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation. Again, I'm using United States sort of focused parlance on the ways in which, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, someone may be able to get an accommodation in an employment space, right? They can request a reasonable accommodation, and then they may be able to just navigate the tool and get the job. And you have a really great hire and they have a really great job and everything is better because of transparency, right? The purpose is
Totally.
not necessarily what it may seem, right? So transparency is a big one. Another thing that I consistently recommend, again, I'll use the employment context. I'm an employer. I want to integrate a tool into whether it's my hiring processes, my HR processes, whatever, is what I call both pre and post deployment audits, right? Specifically for bias against disability. And what that means is like before you integrate a tool, and this, I'm using employment as an example, but it could be across anything, right? An education system, a healthcare system. Before you integrate the tool, you look at the tool and you say, okay, is this potentially biased race, gender, but also disability, right?
Mhm.
And some of that actually does happen that people are doing sort of these pre-deployment audits. But then this other thing I recommend is what I call a post-deployment audit, which means let's say you run an audit on a tool, you think it's really great, you incorporate it, that's it can't stop there, right? And the analogy I use a lot is most people as an employer, as a boss, you don't just hire someone and then say, "Okay, you're on your own," right? You do a performance review where you check in, you see how they're doing. That's what we should be doing with these AI tools, right? We should be seeing how they're doing, auditing them for bias sort of consistently. And if they're not doing well, you don't have to keep using them. You can get rid of them or tweak them or use something else. So I would say like the big three that I think about as very sort of concrete and trying not to be too in the weeds are the transparency, pre-deployment audits, and the post-deployment audits.
Okay, yeah, that's super concrete and I think doesn't really cost anything for a company to implement. And I'm curious, Winston, if you want to build on that, specifically if you have any thoughts on accountability, any tips or tools companies can use on the accountability front to hold themselves to that standard.
Yeah, and I also want to do a quick nod to that point that you made at the start, Sarah, about the overwhelm of trying to accommodate every single
Yeah.
type of disability under the sun. And for me, I think what I would say to that is it's about progress, not perfection, right? Because I feel like sometimes we create this analysis paralysis that then means we do nothing at
Right.
all, right? And so you're better off starting small and building than actually saying this is too much. So I'm just going to look the other way and pretend it's not happening. But to your question about accountability, I think first thing that comes to mind is that it's not one team's responsibility typically within an organization. I think there are many
Mm.
stakeholders, many people who should be held accountable to make sure that these AI systems are accessible and equitable. So thinking about a typical organization, you probably have a procurement team, for example, right, who is responsible for working with vendors and, sourcing different kinds of products and systems that your people would use, right? And so that could look like before we sign this big commitment of a contract, let's make sure our vendors have a strong background in inclusive design or building accessible systems or, making accommodations and alterations to the systems if we do end up having to need that further down the line. Because the other thing, which I think is a myth, is that people think that just because you have an AI system, it is already fully inclusive and doesn't require further customization. But I don't think that's true. So you need to work with vendors and people who will be willing to tailor it to your particular need. Um, Another team or typical division in big corporation is probably most companies have HR and legal or something like that. And so they should be thinking about how this new shiny AI system could affect, your employee rights, your hiring processes, performance reviews, meetings, like anything like that. So they need to be paying attention to that because if that again requires further customization to make it make sense, then the earlier you do it, the cheaper it is to make those changes and the more effective those changes will be. And then I guess design and development teams, we've kind of spoken about that already, but how quickly you can shift left to bring those disabled voices to the table as you build these new cool AI systems. And then maybe also leaders, well, not maybe, definitely leaders have a huge role to play um, in and yeah, and just kind of championing and setting the expectation as an organization that accessibility is it's a non-negotiable, right? And something that we prioritize at the beginning and not look to retrofit after the fact. So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. I think you guys have done a nice job of sort of providing some tools and thoughts from the very beginning of the, inception of adopting a new technology all the way to post launch and accountability and evaluation. So I appreciate that very much. For the sake of time, we're just gonna open up the questions to the audience. So we have a few in the Q&A. I will do my best to pick ones that I think we haven't really addressed yet. I know there was some in the chat too, so if anyone on my team wants to bring up any other questions that came in the chat, let me know. Um, this is a really good one. I'm gonna ask a question about what managers can do because this relates to NOD's huge effort right now to launch our Enable Learning platform. But we have a question that says, as an HR leader, I often get asked by managers how to best offer support, especially for folks who have not disclosed a disability or perhaps don't experience things like neurodivergence as a disability. How do you think AI could help with that? That is a great question.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. So from a management perspective, I think it's actually maybe a bit of a broader conversation about allyship, right? So
Mhm.
when we think about managers who are looking to be a better supporter of their team members who have a disability, you are also in a way saying, how can I be a better ally, right? And so for me, that begins with I guess education is a big part of it. So who is it that you're trying to support? And a big point on education is I sometimes struggle with the idea that, and I've experienced this working for different companies, especially during my tech career, where managers or team members would come to me to learn about disability, and not just my disability, but just disability, full stop. I became the de facto expert of all disabilities. And so I think education needs to be more proactive. There's so many resources out there that we can all access. Even attending a session like this one where you've got different perspectives. You've got different types of disabilities represented. You've got different types of career backgrounds represented as well. You just learn so much that as a manager, you can then take back and think about how you can tailor that to your particular team. And so for me, education is a really big piece of it.
Yeah, and this is Ariana. I'll add into that too. This builds off of my earlier response on inclusive design, right? And so when we design workplaces inclusively, that means that you're also creating an environment where maybe folks don't need to identify as disabled, right? I've been disabled my entire life. And I'm addressing something that's in the chat also just a little bit. I
Thank you, by the way. I was also gonna bring that up, so thank
No,
you.
this is actually quite important. So I appreciate this back and forth that's going on in the chat. I am going to answer the question, but I want to address this too. I am disabled. I identify as a disabled person. When I am talking about myself, that is what I use. In my writing and in my research, I use the terms interchangeably out of an understanding for folks in the community that different people like different things. But me personally, I've been disabled my entire life. I didn't think about myself as having a disability until I was in college, right? So, like, you think of someone who for 20 years, right, was kind of like, huh, I'm different. And in what way? And what does that mean, right? And I think that that is a thing that a lot of folks with disabilities can probably relate to. I also think that for sort of like quote unquote not apparent or what some people consider quote unquote invisible disabilities, that can also be like kind of part of the experience of being like, what is going on? Right? Um, And so relating that back to the workplace question, right? Um, I don't necessarily know that building a workplace wherein, folks get accommodations if they say, "Hello, I have a disability," is necessarily like the best way to go about it, as opposed to kind of building out inclusive practices from the jump, right? And so I'll give a really great, easy, concrete example. Whenever I set a Zoom meeting with someone, my question is always like, "Hey, thanks for this time. I'm looking forward to it. Please let me know if you have any accommodations that you need for the meeting." Right?
Hmm.
That's not
Hmm.
something I do if I know the person has a disability. I just do it with
Hmm.
everyone. Um,
Hmm.
and that's something that, like, especially from the higher levels, right? Let's say you're an HR person, you're a senior leader, you're part of that
Hmm.
leadership, right? You can make access a practice by incorporating those things into daily sort of functioning of the office or of the workplace, right? Um, those are things that can be done. Making the physical space accessible is another one. Um, that again, right? Then maybe someone who has, let's say, a non-apparent disability doesn't have to have the conversation if they don't want to and say, "Hey, some days I can walk and some days I can't," right? Because you've just built an accessible environment and you've built it for your current employees, you've built it for your future employees, and you've built it for visitors. You've made your space into a community space, right? These are all things that just benefit everyone. And again, that sort of goes into the inclusive design of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Winston, anything you want to add or build on there?
Yeah, the small build I have on that is it reminds me of a conversation and I've had many of these conversations where it could be a Q&A like this or just one-to-one, where people say, what's just one thing I can do to be more inclusive for people with disabilities? And I will always say, is your home accessible, right? Like even separate from thinking about the workplace, can a disabled person come into your home? And sometimes people look at me perplexed, like, well, no one in my family has a disability, so why should I be thinking about that? But it's kind of helping to break that paradigm of disability is this thing that affects people out there because should your wife get pregnant, should you break a leg, should you have a temporary kind of disability, then you will need that accommodation. So it's helping to shift that mindset of it's out there and also thinking more about just start where you are. Is if it's your home or if it's your particular office space, how can we make that a little bit more accessible? Even if it's from this day forth, I'm going to turn on live captions with all my meetings. So there's so many micro actions that we could all take.
Yeah, and I'm gonna sort of combine some of the threads that were coming from some questions in the Q&A and from the chats and pose what I think is a really interesting conundrum. Like, I think one of the really interesting and challenging things about creating public policy is that, like, generally there's no right answer, right? You're just talking about trade-offs. And so I think one thing that has come up in questions that I think is, this is the tension, and I'm a big fan of go toward the tension, which is like disclose. We want to know about the use of AI because we're concerned about data, and I agree with something that somebody put in the Q&A that people with disabilities do often have more to lose when it comes to data and sharing personal information, or are more at risk, I'll say. Um, and the accessibility tools that folks with disabilities are using, if they are disclosed, could actually further the biases, right? So how do we navigate that tension between, like, we want disclosure, we want to know what the inputs are, we want all the information about AI tools, and it could create more bias. I think somebody put in the chat the example of, like, I'm using an AI voice clone, but if I tell somebody that, is that going to impact their impression of me? So just curious, right? Like, no answer, but let's just debate this sticky wicket.
Um, Winston, do you want to start or do you want me to?
I can say something briefly. A thought
Yeah.
that just popped into my mind. Um, for me, that this actually kind of takes me, I feel like you just did a whole rewind and took me back to being a software engineer, Sarah. And to me, it feels like as we start to build these systems and create these AI tools, I guess it's just being really intentional about, and this is a bit granular, but for example, what data and what permissions we need to make the tool work, for example, right? So
Mm,
do I need, you know, do I need every single data about your biometrics, your voice, your address, all the time, or do I need it for a specific feature and purpose of that tool? So I think it goes back to designers and developers using almost like a just-in-time way of pulling resources and data so that we're not overexposing people with disabilities to overshare things that they don't need to be sharing all the time and would create a level of discomfort.
hmm
So this is a good question. Um, the answer is not going to be satisfactory because there is no satisfactory answer. What I will say is that there's two different ways to look at this, right? And to a certain extent, part of the question is not just about like, the transparency and the AI side of things. It's also about trade-offs in general, right?
hmm
And what does it mean and you see this idea of trade-offs quite a bit in the context of assistive technology, right? Which was the example given. And you see it in the context of assistive technology and privacy as an example, right? Let's say you're a blind person and you want to use Meta Ray-Ban glasses, but it means that some people are going to be recorded, right? Maybe
Right.
without their knowledge, right?
Right.
And not for nothing, one of the populations of folks who may not know that they're being recorded because the only indicator that you're being recorded is a visual one. It's a light that sort of pulses. It's a white light are blind and low vision folks, right? So members of your let's say you are blind and low vision, you want to use them. There are other blind and low vision folks who may not know that they're being recorded, right? And so these are real conundrums for us as disabled people, right? What I'll say at the outset is that it has never been my position as a disabled community member, as an organizer, or as a policy professional that I should tell a person with a disability what they should or shouldn't use. It's not
hmm
about that for me. What it's about is advocating for better policy and for better products because I don't believe that all of those trade-offs are necessary. Right? I believe that we can build better technology that's more privacy protective, that understands that disability and health related data that is gleaned from people with disabilities is particularly sensitive, that incorporates, the things that Winston's talking about, data minimization, right? Take as little purpose limitation, only use what you need for that purpose, right? Incorporating these sort of basic principles of data governance into building out assistive technologies means that we have better tools available. And then you have, let's say, privacy regulations that would create a policy environment that also makes it better for us, right? And I'm focusing on privacy because it's one of the areas in which I believe, again, that some
hmm
of these trade-offs aren't necessary. The other thing I'll just end on and go back to, right? These questions aren't easy, right? You want transparency, but I want to be able to use these tools. One thing that I will say is that I go back to a lot when I'm thinking about how to answer these very complex questions, the 10 principles of disability justice, right? And among them are solidarity across disabilities, right? Among them are interdependence over independence, right? The idea of that we are a community. And so we have to think about not only how, let's say, using an assistive technology or an AI tool impacts us, but how it can impact the community, right? I am not saying that that provides a concrete answer, but I am saying that I think it provides a philosophical groundwork for how we can think about this and how we should think about it.
Absolutely. Winston, any closing thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say honestly, I'd echo a lot of what Ariana just shared. And the other thing that popped to my mind, a little bit related, but maybe slightly on a tangent, as we are testing these tools. So this is more about, how do we make sure that this is super applicable for people with disabilities and enabling accessibility for them. I think one of the mistakes that even I made as a developer was to base my assumptions on demo environments, so environments where, we had almost perfect conditions or one set of variables to test
Mm,
against. And I think this is a very common mistake because you end up then perpetuating what we've been discussing since the onset, building a system that is just filled with biases and filled with, assumptions that do not make sense in the real world. So, a
mhm,
really good way to mitigate some of that is to make sure that you are testing against real world scenarios, whether that's people who are using different types of assistive technologies or different types of user interfaces, not just the graphical ones. You now have, voice interfaces, you have haptic interfaces as well. And yeah, just making sure that you're widening your scope of testing to
mhm.
include different types of people with disabilities and all the assistive technologies that they might be using.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you both. Thanks to all of the thoughtful questions, the discussions in the chat. This is an amazing, lively, engaged group, so I'm super grateful. Um, Especially, want to give gratitude to our panelists, Ariana and Winston. Such a thoughtful and honest conversation. The perspectives that you guys have really, I think, highlight the urgency of the moment, the opportunity we have to get it right. It is timely. We do need to focus on it now. And just to support that kind of intentionality in design, all of us at NOD, and I know everybody on this webinar, are continuing to invest in the tools and resources that can help organizations to put these sorts of things into practice. Quick plug for our new Enable Learning platform launching this July, groundbreaking digital training system that's specifically designed to help organizations embed inclusion, adaptability, and workforce readiness into everyday operations. Um, we have self-paced, expert design courses that equip leaders, managers, and employees to be able to take actions that improve workplace culture, strengthen team performance, drive innovation, and do it all virtually, flexibly, and effectively. I personally can tell you, written spiel aside, that I actually, even though I work in this space, I worked in the public sector for 10 plus years. I have 3 graduate degrees, and I learned new things from these courses. So I know that they're really valuable to individuals and organizations alike. If you want to keep engaging with us at NOD, we have office hours for our new Enable Learning platform. If you want to learn more, ask questions about how it works. That will be on June 26th from 1 to 1:45. We can send you follow-up information after the webinar. But that's another great opportunity to learn more about that product. We are so grateful for you all. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. We know your time is valuable. And more importantly, thanks for all the work you're doing to create more inclusive workplaces. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.